The wind moved through Echo Creek like something with teeth, cutting past the clapboard buildings and rattling the frosted windows of Miller's General Store. It was Christmas morning, 1891. High on the hill, church bells rang from the white steeple, their sound crisp in the freezing air, calling the faithful to worship. But Clara Reed remained seated on the wooden bench outside the mercantile, her hands clenched tight in her lap. She wasn't counting money. She had nothing left to count. Minutes ago, she had stood inside the pawnshop down the street, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and dust. She had placed her engagement ring on the counter. The diamond Arthur Vance had slid onto her finger with trembling hands in a Boston parlor. It was her last lifeline, her ticket home. The broker hadn't even picked it up. He had merely glanced at it through his loupe, let out a dry, rattling laugh, and pushed it back across the scratched glass. "Paste, miss?" he had said, turning back to his ledger. "Glass and brass. Pretty shine, but I don't buy toys." Glass. The word echoed in her mind now as she sat on the bench. The cold seeped through her thin dress, but she hardly felt it. The cold inside her was colder. Arthur hadn't just left her. He had mocked her. Every promise, every kiss, every plan for their future had been as hollow as that piece of glass in her pocket. She wasn't just abandoned. She was a punchline. Around her, the town stirred with holiday cheer. Families moved down the snow-dusted boardwalk in their Sunday finest. Men in wool coats and derby hats. Women in velvet cloaks with their children bundled beside them. The smell of roasting goose and cinnamon drifted from the houses beyond the square. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. It was thin cotton, a garment meant for gentle eastern springs, not the brutal bite of a Wyoming winter. Her dress, once a respectable gray poplin, hung loose now on a frame that had shed weight she could not afford to lose. 6 months. That was all it had taken for hope, to hollow out a person completely. She had arrived in June with a trunk and a promised future. Arthur had written such letters, pages filled with descriptions of the ranch he was building. She had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? The trunk still sat in the room she rented above the bakery. She could not afford to keep it much longer. Mrs. Gable had made that clear 3 days ago, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "I run a respectable establishment, Miss Reed," she had said. "Not a charity house." Miss Reed, not Mrs. Vance. The town had made certain she understood that distinction. When the stagecoach had deposited her in Echo Creek that June afternoon, dusty and expectant, Arthur had been waiting, but not alone. The woman beside him wore a wedding band that caught the sunlight, and when Arthur introduced her without shame as his wife of 2 years, Clara felt something inside her go perfectly still. Now she pulled the ring out of her pocket. It caught the weak winter sun, sparkling with a cruel, artificial brilliance. She should throw it into the snow. She should scream, but she had no energy left for anger. She stared at the ring, hypnotized by the lie of it. Her hands were numb, her fingers red and stiff. She barely noticed when her grip slackened and the ring slipped from her frozen fingers. It didn't make a sound as it landed in the snowbank at her feet. She looked down at it. It belonged there, buried in the cold, just like her life. "You dropped something." The voice came from beside her, low and quiet, like the rumble of distant thunder. Clara turned to find a figure standing at the edge of the bench. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a worn sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. She could not see his face clearly in the shadow of the brim, only the sharp line of his jaw and the weathered texture of his skin. He bent down, his movements slow and deliberate, and retrieved the ring from the snow. He held it up, inspecting it for a moment in the harsh light before holding it out to her in a gloved hand. "No," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't want it." The stranger didn't move. He looked at the ring, then at her tear-streaked face. "It's yours, isn't it?" "It's nothing," she said. "It's glass. It's a lie." The man watched her, his gray eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer false comfort. He simply nodded. closed his gloved fist around the ring, and set it gently on the bench beside her. "Even a lie weighs something," he said. "Don't let it freeze you out here." Clara looked up at him then. He wasn't looking at the ring. He was looking at her boots, worn through at the toes, and the thin shawl that was failing to keep her alive. "I know what you're doing," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only a flatness that suggested he had seen this particular kind of desperation before. "You're waiting, trying to figure out if the cold will take you before the hunger does." Clara felt something crack inside her chest. The accuracy of his observation was unbearable. She looked away, blinking against the sudden heat behind her eyes. "The answer," he continued, "is neither. You can't solve this by sitting here." "I have nowhere to go," she said. "I have nothing." "I have a proposition," he said. "Not charity, not pity. Work, if you're willing." Clara's heart stuttered. She looked up at him. "Work? I need a cook and housekeeper," he said. "My ranch is 12 miles north of town. The work is hard, the place is isolated, and I can't pay much. But there's a room, 3 meals, and wages enough to save if you're careful." He paused, then added, "It's honest work, miss. Nothing more." Clara searched what she could see of his face, looking for the lie, the hidden intention. She found only patience. He waited, unmoving, while she wrestled with pride and desperation. Finally, she asked the only question that mattered. "Why me?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his words fell like stones into still water. "Because you're not carrying this alone anymore," he said. "Not if you don't want to." Clara sat in the back of the wagon as it rolled north out of Echo Creek, her trunk secured behind her with rope. She watched the town shrink against the white landscape until the buildings were nothing more than dark smudges against the snow. The cowboy, who had given his name as Silas Thorne, handled the reins with the ease of long practice, saying nothing as the horses pulled them along the frozen road. She had accepted his offer. What choice did she have? Mrs. Gable had made it clear the room above the bakery would not be available past the week's end. Still, as the last signs of civilization faded from view and the vast Wyoming prairie opened before them, Clara felt the weight of what she had done settle over her. She was riding into isolation with a man she did not know, to a place she had never seen. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in snow, stands of pine dark against the white, the sky so wide and empty it made her feel small. They passed no other travelers, saw no other homesteads, just mile after mile of winter silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. After an hour, Silas finally spoke. "The house is simple," he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. 2 rooms downstairs, kitchen and sitting area. 2 rooms upstairs. You'll have one of those. I take the other." Clara listened, pulling her shawl tighter against the wind. "There's a barn, a smokehouse, and a root cellar," he continued. "Chickens, 2 milk cows, and a dozen horses I'm training for sale come spring." Clara nodded, though he was not looking at her. "What happened to your last housekeeper?" she asked. "Never had one," he replied. "Been managing alone since I bought the place 3 years back." He adjusted his grip on the reins. "But the work's gotten ahead of me. I spend my days with the horses and come inside to cold stoves and dirty dishes. It's no way to live." "Why now?" Clara asked. "Why offer help today of all days?" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, his voice low, he spoke, "Because I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere left to turn. And because it's Christmas, seemed like the right time to stop being selfish with space I'm not using." There was something in his voice, not pity but recognition. "The town will talk," Clara said quietly, "about me living out here, about the impropriety." "They already talk," Silas said. "About you, about me, about everyone who doesn't fit their notion of proper." He glanced back at her then, and for the first time she saw his eyes clearly, gray as winter clouds and just as unreadable. "Question is," he said, whether you can afford to care. She could not. That was the brutal arithmetic of her situation. Reputation was a luxury for women with options. Clara had none. "I'll work hard," she said instead. "I know how to cook, how to clean, how to mend." "I don't doubt it," he replied. "Wages are $10 a month plus room and board. It's not generous, but it's fair. You'll have Sundays to yourself unless there's an emergency with the stock." $10 a month, Clara calculated quickly. In 6 months, she could save enough to leave. She could start again in a place where no one knew about Arthur Vance or the glass ring. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. Silas's mouth quirked slightly. "Figure you already have. You're on the property now, near enough." The road curved, and through a gap in the pines, Clara caught her first glimpse of the ranch. It was a simple wooden structure with a stone chimney, smoke rising thin and gray into the winter sky. The barn behind it was larger, newer, built with care. Around it all, fencing marked boundaries in the snow. It was isolated, it was plain, it was nothing like the future she had imagined when she left Boston, but it was shelter, it was work. "It'll do," Clara said quietly, more to herself than to him. Silas nodded once. "Yes," he agreed, "it will." The first week passed in careful orbit. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch the way one learns a new language, through observation, repetition, and the occasional stumble. She woke before dawn to stoke the kitchen stove, learning its temperament. By the time pale light crept through the eastern windows, she had coffee boiling and cornmeal mush ready in the pot. Silas ate quickly, without comment, then disappeared into the cold to tend the animals. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, the way he moved through his morning tasks with an economy of motion that spoke of years alone. He fed the chickens, milked the cows, hauled water from the pump to the horse troughs, all before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She did not offer to help with the outside work. He did not ask her to. The boundary between their labors remained unspoken, but clear. Her domain was the house. And the house, she discovered, had been neglected in ways that only a solitary man could neglect a place. Not filthy, but worn. The floors needed scrubbing. The windows were thick with months of dust. The cupboards held mismatched dishes and supplies arranged without logic. Clara cleaned methodically, room by room, finding a strange comfort in the work. Here was something she could control. Each surface she scrubbed, each window she cleared, felt like a small reclamation of order in a life that had become chaos. On the third day, while sweeping the upstairs hallway, she noticed the door to Silas's room stood slightly ajar. A glimpse through the opening showed her something unexpected. Books, a small shelf of them beside his bed, their spines worn from reading. She had not expected that. Had not imagined this quiet cowboy spending his evenings with literature. She said nothing about it, just as he said nothing about finding her late one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with tears running silent down her face, her hands pressed flat against the worn wood, as if trying to anchor herself to something solid. He had simply set a cup of coffee beside her, said nothing, and retreated to his room. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was about practical things, the supplies running low, the weather turning, the mare in the barn who was favoring her left foreleg. Their conversations were transactional, careful, but Clara was learning him nonetheless, learning that he took his coffee black and strong, that he worked through pain. She saw him favor his right shoulder on cold mornings, that he had nightmares sometimes. She could hear him moving restlessly in the room above hers, and perhaps he was learning her, too. He began leaving extra wood by the kitchen stove without her asking, started taking his boots off at the door without being told. Once she found wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen sill, dried things brittle with winter but arranged with unexpected care. 2 weeks in, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Silas work with a young stallion in the corral. The horse was skittish, wild-eyed, fighting the lead rope, but Silas moved with patience, his voice too low for her to hear, his hands steady. He did not force, did not rush, simply waited, letting the animal come to trust in its own time. She recognized something in that approach, the same patience he had shown her, the same careful distance. He was gentling her, the way he gentled those horses, not with control, but with the quiet offer of safety, repeated until it was believed. It should have made her angry, that comparison. Should have felt condescending, but it did not, because she understood, watching him there in the cold, that he was not trying to break her wildness. He was simply creating space for it to exist without judgment. That night, for the first time since arriving, Clara set 2 plates on the table instead of preparing his meal and leaving it covered while she ate alone in the kitchen. When Silas came in from the evening chores, he paused in the doorway, taking in the change. "Thought we might eat at the same time," Clara said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Seems foolish to heat the room twice." It was a small thing, a practical thing, but they both knew it was more than that. Silas hung his hat on the peg by the door and washed his hands at the basin. "Makes sense," he said quietly. They sat across from each other at the pine table, the lamp between them casting soft light, and ate in silence. But it was a different silence now. Not the careful distance of strangers, but the beginning of something else, something neither of them had words for yet. It happened on a Tuesday in late January. Silas was out checking the fence line, and Clara had decided to tackle the pantry, a narrow, dusty closet tucked behind the kitchen that smelled of dry rot and neglect. She was clearing out stacks of old canning jars, wiping away years of dust, when she found the stack of newspapers. Silas must have used them for packing material when he moved in. They were crumpled, yellowed, and brittle with age, dating back 2 years. Clara began to smooth them out, intending to use them to line the shelves. Her eyes moved idly over the headlines: prices of grain, a fire in Chicago, an advertisement for patent medicine. Then she stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. There, near the bottom of a page from the Denver Gazette, was a sketch. It was crude, drawn in charcoal, but the line of the jaw was unmistakable. The way the hair curled over the collar, the charm in the smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Arthur. She leaned closer, her hands shaking so hard the brittle paper rattled. The headline above the sketch read, "The Gentleman Thief Strikes Again." She read the article, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The man in the sketch wasn't named Arthur Vance. He was known as Silky Slim, or sometimes the Professor, a conman wanted in 3 territories for bigamy, fraud, and theft. He targeted women of good standing, promised them marriage, took their dowries, and vanished into the night. There were others. Dozens of them. Women in St. Louis, Denver, Santa Fe. Some had been left penniless. Some had been left with debts they could never repay. One woman in Colorado had taken her own life after the shame of it. Clara sank to the floor, the paper crinkling in her grip. The glass ring, the wife at the station. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a game, a calculated game he had played with her life. "Clara?" The back door opened with a gust of wind. Silas stomped the snow from his boots and walked into the kitchen. He froze when he saw her sitting on the floor, surrounded by jars, her face pale as milk. "What is it?" He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to one knee beside her. "Are you hurt?" She couldn't speak. She just shoved the paper toward him, her finger pressing against the sketch. Silas took it. His eyes scanned the text. His jaw tightened until a muscle feathered in his cheek. He read it once, then looked at the sketch, then back at Clara. "He was a professional," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "He didn't just leave you, Clara. He hunted you." Clara let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I thought I was foolish," she whispered. "I thought I drove him away. I thought I wasn't enough." "No." Silas dropped the paper and took her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding her. "Look at me. This man is a wolf. You don't blame the sheep for the wolf's hunger." Clara looked up at him, tears finally spilling over. "I've been carrying his shame," she said. wearing it like it belonged to me. Yes, Silas said, and it's time to put it down. He pulled her into his arms then, awkward and stiff at first, but solid. Clara buried her face in the rough wool of his coat and wept. She wept for the girl who had believed in fairy tales, and she wept for the woman who had to survive the truth. Silas held her through it all, his presence a quiet promise that she could fall apart here and still be safe. February came in hard, bringing with it storms that buried the ranch in snow and kept them confined for days at a time. Clara and Silas moved through the house like dancers learning a careful choreography, passing each other in doorways, sharing meals, existing in a companionship that asked for nothing but offered everything. On the third day of the worst storm, with wind howling against the walls and snow piling against the windows, Silas finally spoke about himself. They sat by the fire after supper, Clara mending one of his shirts while he cleaned his rifle with methodical care. The lamp flickered between them, and outside, the world had disappeared into white darkness. "I had a wife once," he said, not looking up from his work, "and a son." Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. She waited, knowing that some stories had to be offered, not pulled. "This was in Oregon, 7 years back. I was working a farm down near the valley, saving to buy my own place." His hands continued their careful movements, running the cloth along the barrel. "Eleanor, that was her name. She was expecting our second child. Jack was 3 years old, bright boy, always asking questions, always following me around the barn." The firelight cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his eyes. Diphtheria came through that winter, took Jack first, then Eleanor and the baby she was carrying. His voice remained steady, but Clara saw his hands go still on the rifle. 3 weeks, he said. "That's all it took to empty my life." Clara set down her mending. "Silas, I sold everything after," he said. "Couldn't stay in that place. Couldn't look at Jack's toys or Eleanor's dresses hanging in the wardrobe. Came east to Wyoming, bought this ranch, and told myself I'd never let anyone close enough to lose again." He looked at her then, and his eyes held a pain so deep it made her chest ache. "Worked pretty well for 3 years, until a woman sat on a bench in town, freezing to death, because she wouldn't admit she was broken." "Why?" Clara asked softly. "Why did you stop? Why didn't you walk past?" "Because I saw myself in you," he answered. "That moment when you've got nothing left, but you're still breathing, still trying to find a way forward even though you can't see one." He set the rifle aside. "And because I was tired, Clara, tired of being alone, tired of punishing myself for surviving when they didn't." The wind rattled the windows, the fire popped and settled. Clara felt something shift in her chest, like a door she had kept locked suddenly swinging open. Spring arrived in April, turning the white hills into brilliant green. The thaw began in late March, turning the world to mud and slush, but the air held the promise of green things waiting beneath. But while the land was waking up, a quiet tension had settled over the house. Silas had grown distant. He spent longer hours in the barn, and when he came in for meals, he wouldn't meet her eyes. One evening, after the dishes were cleared, Silas placed a small tin box on the table. It was the box where he kept the household money. "Sit down, Clara," he said. His voice sounded tired, defeated. Clara sat, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's wrong? Is it the stock?" "The winter was hard," Silas said. He opened the tin. It was empty. "Feed cost more than I planned. And the sale of the horses, the buyer in Cheyenne backed out yesterday." He pushed the empty tin toward her. "I can't pay you," he said. "I can't even feed us both, not properly, not until late summer, and that's a gamble I won't take with your life." Clara stared at the empty tin. "What are you saying?" "I spoke to the circuit preacher," Silas said, looking at his hands. "He's heading to the city tomorrow. He's agreed to take you. There's work there. Good work for a woman with your skills. You can find a life there, Clara, a real home, not this struggle." He stood up, turning his back to her, pretending to check the fire. "Pack your trunk. You leave at dawn." Clara looked at his broad back, seeing the tension in his shoulders. She understood then. He wasn't sending her away because he didn't want her. He was sending her away because he loved her enough to want her safe. He was choosing his own loneliness over her hardship. She stood up. She didn't go to her room. She walked to the fireplace and stood between him and the flames. "No," she said. Silas looked down at her, startled. "Clara, be reasonable. I have nothing left to give you." "You think I'm here for the wages?" she asked. "You think I stayed through the blizzard for $10 a month?" "I think you deserve better than starving on a failed ranch," he snapped, the cracks showing in his composure. "I won't watch you hollow out again. Not on my watch." "I've been poor, Silas," she said, stepping closer, "and I've been rich, and I've been alone. Of all those things, alone is the only one I can't bear to be again." She reached out and took his hand. It was trembling. "I'm not going to the city," she said firmly. "If we have to eat cornmeal and roots until summer, then we do it. But we do it here, together." Silas stared at her, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a look of wonder. "You'd stay, knowing there's nothing?" "There isn't nothing," she said, squeezing his hand. "There's you, and that's all I've ever wanted." He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he lifted his other hand and cupped her cheek. "Then I'm choosing you, too," he whispered. "Not as a housekeeper, as a partner, as someone I want to build a future with, if you'll have a man with nothing but a broken heart and a patch of dirt." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. But these were different than any she had shed before. These were tears of choosing, of claiming. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it arrived, it came with purpose. The snow retreated from the fields, revealing brown earth that would soon turn green. The horses grew restless in their corral, sensing the change in the air. And in the simple wooden house 12 miles north of Echo Creek, two people who had learned to survive alone began learning something harder: how to build a life together. Clara stood at the kitchen window on a morning in early April, watching Silas work with the young stallion that had been so wild in winter. The horse moved freely now, responding to the gentlest pressure of the lead rope. Its trust earned through months of patient repetition. She understood that journey, had lived it herself. Her hands moved to her apron pocket. It was empty now. She had thrown the glass ring into the creek weeks ago, watching the water carry away the last piece of Arthur Vance. They had married quietly 3 weeks ago, with the circuit preacher who passed through every spring and 2 ranch hands as witnesses. No celebration, no announcement, just promises spoken in a front room while April rain drummed against the roof. The town would talk, of course. Already had, according to the supply merchant, but Clara found she did not care, the way she once would have. Their judgment could not touch what she and Silas had built in the quiet of winter. Trust earned in silence, partnership forged through shared work, love that grew like prairie grass, slow and deep-rooted. She heard the door open behind her, felt Silas's presence before his arms came around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come," she said, leaning back into him. "How different this April is from last Christmas." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him nod. "You saved more than yourself when you stayed," he said softly. "You saved me too." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at the face she had come to know as well as her own. The gray eyes that still held sadness, but now held hope as well. The weathered skin that creased when he smiled, which he did more often now. "We saved each other," she corrected. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, flooding the kitchen with golden light. It fell across the pine table where they shared their meals, across the clean floor she had scrubbed, across the wildflowers, fresh ones this time, alive with spring, that Silas had picked and placed in a jar that morning. The light fell across them both, and Clara thought about that Christmas morning when she had sat alone, holding a piece of glass and believing she was worthless. She had been wrong. Hope was not something that happened. It was something you chose, again and again. Even when choosing felt impossible, she had chosen, and in choosing, she had found her way home. "Come on," Silas said, releasing her gently. "We've got work to do." Clara smiled, took his hand, and stepped with him into the light of a new day.